All right, good morning, everyone. My name is Heather Collins. I'm one of your MLS instructors, and I'm joined this morning by your presenter, Miss Lori Solecki.
Good morning.
And your webinar is going to be on intermediary in the middle. Before Miss Lori gets started, let me just go over if you have any questions while we go through the webinar, feel free to type them in your chat. If you do not see the chat on your screen, you should see a orange arrow to the right, which you click, and then it will open that up in your chat window to send us any messages. We will be answering those throughout the webinar. We may hold most questions to the very end, but feel free to go ahead and ask your question if anything is needed, and we will answer as quickly as possible. Well, Miss Lori, I think I'm going to hand it on over to you, and we're going to get started, everyone.
All right, great. Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, thank you for attending, everyone. Good morning. So we're going to talk a little bit about intermediary, that strange animal in our agency group. So just to give you a little history, in the beginning, there was caveat emptor. Remember, buyer beware. So the unusual thing was that everyone, all brokers and all agents represented only one party, and that was the seller. That was it. So that means if you were the listing firm, the listing house, the broker and all of their agents, plus any other real estate firms, acted as sub-agents and agents only for the seller. So we all used to represent the seller. Now, buyers cried foul and decided that perhaps there is a better way. So in the fall of 1993, Texas did allow for a statutory dual agency where you represent both parties. Now, later, in January 1 of 1996, the intermediary actually became effective. September 1 of 2005, the old dual agency is laid to rest. It becomes unlawful. So do not practice dual agency because it is unlawful in Texas, and it eliminated the old Senate Bill 314. Now, with that, it also had to change the occupation code because, as you know, anytime we have legislation, everything gets changed. So our licensing act, our TREC rules, occupation codes, everything changes to go right along with legislation. That's why we have that Legal 1 and Legal 2 every 2 years, because what happens every 2 years? That's right, legislation. So there you go. So along with that, let's talk a little bit about the occupation code. So what does that say about the intermediary? Well, there are 3 distinct sections of the occupation code, and here's what they talk about. The intermediary must have written consent, so it must be in writing. You have to agree on compensation, who is going to pay who. You must have a written prior agreement. So what is that written prior agreement? Well, it's a listing agreement for the seller landlord, or it's a buyer agreement for the tenant buyer. And you must act fairly and impartially when you are being an intermediary. Now, what are the rules? Okay, so here's the thing. Only the broker may decide if they're going to appoint or not. I know sometimes in our world, agents talk and, hey, I've got the seller, you've got the buyer, so we're just going to appoint. You be them, you work for them, I'll work for them. But here's the thing, the broker is the one who has to appoint. Only the broker can do that. Now they may choose to appoint one to the seller and one to the buyer, but again, you must have written consent by all parties. If there is an appointment, and this is key, then you may give advice and opinion. So that means that you can represent the buyer or the seller. Agents are appointed, so those agents may represent the buyer or the seller as if they never worked under the same brokerage house. So they can give advice and opinion, strategy, and represent them to the fullest. The only difference is there are 4 things that you're not allowed to do. There are 4 restrictions in the intermediary. One being that you can't tell the seller the buyer is willing to pay more. The second being that you can't tell the buyer that the seller is willing to take less. The third is that we must treat all parties honestly, and we cannot share confidential information unless we have written permission from either the seller or the buyer. So those are the 4 limitations that you have regarding intermediary. The next thing deals with whether or not the broker wants to offer intermediary, because brokers are not required to offer intermediary. So your brokerage house is going to decide whether or not they will allow intermediary. And of course, the seller landlord and the buyer tenant have to agree to allow intermediary as well. So as you can see, it is between the broker and the principals. So how is written consent found? All right, so we have listing agreements. So whether you have the TAR listing agreement or you use your company's listing agreement, either way, somewhere in the listing agreement, there should be something that talks about intermediary. So in our listing agreement, if you use the TAR form, it's found in paragraph 9. It talks about the intermediary. Now with that, it says that the broker may show the property to interested prospective buyers who the broker represents. And it says if a prospective buyer who they represent offers to buy the property, then the seller authorizes the broker to act as an intermediary. The broker will then notify the seller that the broker will service the parties in accordance with one of the following alternatives. So you've got 3 alternatives. You've got if a prospective buyer who the broker represents is serviced by an associate other than the associate servicing the seller under the listing, then the broker may notify the seller that the broker will A, appoint the associate then servicing the seller to communicate with, carry out instructions of, and provide opinions and advice during negotiations to the seller. And they'll appoint the associate then servicing the prospective buyer to the prospective buyer for the same purpose. So what does this mean? If you have an agent representing the seller and a different agent represents the buyer, then the broker will appoint those same agents to represent. So you have buyer, seller, and 2 agents. There's another opportunity that if a prospective buyer who the broker represents is serviced by the same associate who is servicing the seller, then the broker may notify the seller that the broker will appoint another associate to communicate with, carry out instructions of, and provide opinions and advice during negotiations to the prospective buyer, and appoint the associate serving the seller under the listing to the seller for the same purpose. So what does that mean? If you're the listing agent, you have a buyer under a buyer agreement that you've been working with. Suddenly that buyer wants to purchase that listing that you have. It says the broker will bring in another person to represent the buyer because the seller relationship is primary. So the listing agent will always represent the seller, and they will bring another agent to come in and help the buyer. Or it could be number 3, which says the broker will notify the seller that the broker will make no appointments as prescribed under paragraph 9A. And in such event, the associate servicing the parties, buyer and seller, will act solely as broker's intermediary representative, who may facilitate, keyword facilitate, the transaction, but will not render advice or opinions during negotiations to either party. So this is a situation where you have one agent, you have a buyer and a seller, and that one agent is going to take care of both. Now we're going to look at how that representation truly looks. and we're going to look at, are we really letting our client know how that looks? Or they have the opportunity to check B, which says, hey, we don't want intermediary. The seller agrees the broker will not show the property to prospective buyers who the broker represents. And then we have those 4, and they've added the License Act, so now we actually have 5 limitations regarding what we cannot do if we represent as intermediary. Again, as I said, you can't disclose to the buyer the seller would take a less price. You can't disclose to the seller the buyer would pay a greater price. You can't disclose confidential information unless it's given in writing or it's required by law. You can't treat a party dishonestly, and you may not violate the Real Estate License Act. So this is what we find in listing agreements. Now, what is the other written consent? Well, let's look at the flip side and look at buyer agreements. So if you use the TAR Buyer Representation Agreement, then you are going to find that in paragraph 8. And you're going to see that it mirrors the listing agreement, except it's just for the buyer. So if you look at that, on A, you're going to see that the client desires to see the broker's listings. So if the client wishes to acquire one of the broker's listings, then the client authorizes the broker to act as an intermediary, and the broker will notify the client that the broker will service the parties in accordance with one of the following alternatives. So here we have 3 choices again, and they mirror very closely to the listing agreement. So here's the deal. Number 1, if the owner of the property is serviced by an associate other than the associate servicing the client, so that means 2 agents, buyer and seller, then the broker may notify the client that the broker will appoint the associate then servicing the owner to communicate with, carry out instructions of, and provide advice and opinion during negotiations to the owner, and appoint the associate now serving the buyer-client to represent the buyer-client for the same purpose. So we have the same exact thing that we had in paragraph 1 on the listing agreement. Paragraph 2 talks about if the owner of the property is serviced by the same associate who is servicing the buyer-client, then the broker may notify the buyer-client that the broker will appoint another associate to communicate with, carry out instructions of, and provide opinions and advice during negotiation to the buyer-client, and appoint the associate serving the owner under the listing to the owner for the same purpose. So you have kind of the flip side here on paragraph 2. If the buyer-client is represented by one agent, and that agent also has the listing, the broker will pull the agent from the buyer-client and let them help the seller. They will then assign another agent to represent the buyer-client. And then, of course, paragraph 3 says that they'll make no appointments, and again, the associate servicing the parties, the seller and the buyer, will act solely as their intermediary representative who may facilitate the transaction, but not render opinions and advice during negotiations to either party. And then, of course, they have the opportunity to say, no, I don't want intermediary status, and I don't wish to be shown or acquire any of the broker's listings. Again, we have the same notice down here, which is the same exact thing we talked about. You can't disclose to the buyer, the seller would take less. You can't disclose to the seller, the buyer would pay more. You can't disclose any confidential information. You can't treat them dishonestly, and you will comply with the Real Estate Act. So there you go. So these are all on the TAR forms. Hopefully your company has them on your forms as well if you use those company forms.
Lori, it looks like you did just get a question. It says the 5 rules in notice under paragraphs 8 and 9 of the seller and buyer agreements apply even if the intermediary with appointments, correct?
That's correct. So even though you have appointments and you can represent them as if you worked at another agency, there are limitations under the intermediary, and those are the limitations. So again, remember, if you act as intermediary, appointed or not, then you cannot disclose to the buyer the seller would take less. You can't disclose to the seller the buyer would pay more. You can't share confidential information, and you have to treat all parties honestly, and you have to comply with the Real Estate License Act. Good question. All right, so understanding the rules. Let's look a little bit at the rules. So remember, it is the broker who decides if they will first offer intermediary at their brokerage firm. And they don't have to offer intermediary. They could treat them as a customer, not a client, a customer. Now, the parties, again, have to agree in writing to allow intermediary. Remember, they have those two options. They can check A, they will, or B, they won't. And then once the broker decides, they're going to decide if they will appoint or not. Now, this is where it gets really tricky because truly you must have 2 agents in order to appoint, okay? You must have at least 2 agents in the brokerage house because the broker is not allowed to appoint themselves. The broker must stay out of it. So if there's 1 agent with a buyer, then the broker may appoint another agent to represent the buyer. So remember, 1 agent, 2 people, the broker has the right to bring in another agent. So if you have the listing and you have the buyer, the broker has the right to make you work with the seller and then bring in another agent. So we have another question.
It's saying, if the broker decides to make an appointment for the buyer, can the listing agent accept a referral fee? And if so, does the referral fee need to be disclosed to the buyer and to the seller?
That's a great question, Melinda. Okay, so if the broker decides to make an appointment for the buyer, yes, if the broker allows, you could do a referral. And yes, any fees that you get have to be disclosed to both parties. So you can let them know this is what we are going to do.
Looks like you have another question. If a single agent is operating under an LLC with a sponsoring broker, can an agent perform a transaction in an intermediary capacity?
The answer to that is yes, but it's very tricky because at that point you would be 1 agent and you would be working with the seller and the buyer. The broker has to be out of it because the broker cannot appoint themselves to one or the other. And at that point, you would be no advice and no opinion. And we're going to show you a good visual for that here in just a minute. So to be clear, the intermediary can be the same agent. It can be, but again, it is no advice, no opinion. So I'm going to continue on and hopefully this will become clear. Give me just a minute and hopefully it will make more sense. All right, so remember, the broker may decide not to appoint. Understand that too. So here's what intermediary with appointments looks like, okay? Intermediary with appointments means that you can give advice and opinion. You can share strategies, okay? But again, we talk about the restrictions. You cannot, again, I'm going to go over this, tell the seller the buyer would pay more, tell the buyer the seller would take less, share confidential information unless it's required by law or materially relates to the condition of the property, and you cannot treat a party dishonestly. So again, you can give advice and opinion, and that's the key with intermediary. 2 agents, buyer and seller, you can give advice and opinion. But again, you must have 2 or more agents to appoint. Now, here's a good visual. This is intermediary without appointments. Okay? Intermediary without appointments means no advice, no opinion, no strategy. That means you are a facilitator. What does that mean? A facilitator position is where you say, how do you want me to proceed? Here, how do you want me to fill this out? Then you go to your seller, here's an offer. Yay, we've got an offer. Just curious, how do you want me to respond? And really, it is a tough position to be in. Why? because you are not allowed to give any information. Basically, you're saying, you've spent all this time with the seller, you've spent all this time with a buyer, and now they're asking you questions. Well, Lori, what do you think I should offer? I don't know. I'm shrugging my shoulders. I don't know. Here's the information. You tell me. Well, do you think we ought to ask for a home warranty? I don't know. I'm shrugging my shoulders. You check it out. Decide what you want to do. Then you go to the seller. Hi, Mr. Seller. Yay, good news. We've got an offer. Here you go. What would you like to do? Well, Lori, do you think we ought to do this? I don't know. They shrug their shoulders. Because you're not allowed to give advice and opinion. Now, I want you to get a good picture of that. Who wants that kind of representation? I mean, seriously, I really feel that we kind of drop the ball and really don't share with our clients how this really looks, because it is very, very limited. It is very limited. And not, to mention, it is the most litigated opportunity in agency. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. So understand the broker cannot appoint themselves. And the broker also has to stay out of it in the fact that they're not allowed to give advice or opinion to the seller, the buyer, or even the agents. So this becomes really sticky, okay? Only factual information can be shared. And remember, you are a facilitator. You are just sharing terms. Here's what the seller wants. Here's what the buyer wants. What do you want to do? What do you want to do? You can't give any preferential treatment. And a lot of times, this occurs when a broker is a sole proprietor, or perhaps it's them and one agent. So at that point, you have intermediary without appointments. Now here's the thing. It is one of the most litigated opportunities in agency. I will tell you that. Many times clients have filed suits against brokers. They feel like the agent was just, doing what was best for them, forgetting the fiduciary obligation. They wanted both sides, and so they really should have been given to someone else who could have given them advice and opinion. And a jury, if you have to go to court, will look unfavorably at you, because here's what you're going to have to prove. I had a listing. Ms. Solecki, how long did you have the listing? Well, I had it probably for 45 days. And then how long did you work with the buyer? I had them for 30 days. And then you put them together with your listing. Is that correct? Yes. And then you acted as intermediary with no appointments. Is that correct? Yes. So you're telling me you did not give any preferential treatment, even though you had a longer relationship with the seller. Is that what you're telling me? And you worked shoulder to shoulder with the buyer, but yet you're telling me that you could have backed out of it and not given any preferential treatment. And was that a good use of the fiduciary responsibility? So do you see where this could be a problem if you're in court to try to get them to agree that, yes, I acted totally impartially? So it's just not a good place to be. Forget the double dip. Everybody loves the double dip where you get both sides. But I'm just telling you, be careful. It's worth it to just go ahead and let your broker assign someone else. All right. Intermediary is not this. Hey, let me take care of you both. I'll fast track the whole deal. Hey, let's not get another agent involved. It'll be easier if it's just me. And, don't worry, I can represent you both, no problems. Hey, I'll see if I can get the best deal possible. Since we're working on this together, I should really let you know, here's the seller's situation, or hey, here's the buyer's situation. Don't get caught doing that if you're acting as intermediary, because you are not allowed to share that information. So I see a lot of questions coming up. So before I move on, I'm going to answer some questions.
All right, looks like we have one new question. It's a scenario question from Jean. It says, as a listing agent, she gets a buyer whom wants to buy one of her listings. However, she doesn't sign the buyer's rep agreement with this buyer, which means she works as a sub-agent. In this case, she can provide advice and suggestion to the seller, but not to the buyer. Is that correct?
That is correct. Because at that point, you are not intermediary. Remember, intermediary require that you have written authority to do so from the principals, from the buyer sellers.
Okay. Looks like we have one more question came through. What is the morality of fiduciary relationships?
That's a good question. So, as far as morality, I don't know. Let me explain what the fiduciary is. So, if we go back to our school days when we got our licensing, fiduciary actually means, it's old car. You remember old car? Obedience, loyalty, confidentiality, accounting, reasonable care. Okay, so that's our fiduciary relationship with our clients. Putting the client's interest first is the whole heart of being a good fiduciary. So let me ask you this. Are you putting your client first if you aren't allowing them to have the representation that they really should get? If your hands are tied and you're not allowed to basically give them that that care, that reasonable care, to give them that loyalty, that disclosure, that confidence or confidentiality, I mean, is that really being a good fiduciary just because you want to be on both sides? That's all I'm saying. It's hard to serve two masters, okay? It really is. You can't give them the best if it's just you. So I would encourage you, consider bringing in another agent. Consider letting your broker appoint. So there's a question, then why in the world would Texas allow intermediary status? Well, here's the thing. Because you have business models where perhaps you're an independent broker and you're a sole proprietor. At that point, you can do intermediary. But again, it's with no appointments. No appointments. So there's no one to appoint. It's just you. But again, if you are sharing, here's what that's going to look like, Mr. Seller and Mr. Buyer. Here's how that's going to look. My hands are tied. I am a facilitator. I cannot share advice and opinion with you. If you want that kind of representation, then you're going to need to get someone else. Or you can work with them as a customer. But Texas will allow for that simply because, they will allow for all intermediary, and that's just one piece. So intermediary with appointments is great. Intermediary without appointments is tough.
Okay.
Very tough.
And it looks like I got two other little questions here. One from Kelly. In the sub-agent question, does this not create implied agency?
So that's a great question. So yes, it kind of does create implied agency. But here's the thing I want you guys to remember, and we're going to look at this under the intermediary notice or second consent, as some people talk about, then you actually must have a written agreement prior to intermediary. So here's the thing. Let's look at this form real quick. Under the notice, owner means the seller or landlord of the property, and prospect means the above named prospective buyer or tenant. The broker's firm represents the owner under a listing agreement and also represents the prospect under a buyer-tenant representation agreement. Now, in that scenario, she did not have a buyer-tenant representation agreement, did she? So at that point, she's already out. So at that point, yes, she might have been implied agency, but according to the rules, for the intermediary to be allowed, it must be in writing. Okay. It must be in writing.
Okay. And Miss Lori, I got one more question if you wanted to answer. Can you get paid a referral fee from the agent that the broker appoints for the other side?
Well, I'm going to defer that to your broker. So whatever your broker agrees to do, then that's what you get to do. So that will come actually from your broker. So your broker is going to have to decide. So when does the notice have to be given? Well, you already have it shared. You've already shared it in the first consent, or you've already shared it in the buyer agreement and the seller agreement. So the client is aware about what you should do, okay? If we have an intermediary situation, here's what's going to happen, okay? So they're already aware. This intermediary notice actually is the TAR form. It's form 1409, and this actually allows you to go ahead and make it official. You actually don't have to have this form necessarily, but it is just a clarity form. So it says, hey, you guys entered into a relationship agreement, you had a written agreement, and in that agreement, you previously authorized the broker, look at C, you previously authorized the broker to act as an intermediary. And so we are going to act in accordance with the authorizations granted. So in D it says either they will appoint or they won't appoint. Now if they will, they're going to appoint Larry Listum to the owner and Betty Buyer's agent to the prospect. Okay? And by acknowledging this receipt of notice, you affirm that it's okay to do this. And then F talks about if there were any prior, relationships that you want to discuss. Okay? Now, okay, I have an interesting question here.
Okay.
So I have a buyer broker that asked the question. Texas started allowing dual agency 6 months after he started doing a show in Dallas. He believes it was because they were making public the fact that sub-agency listing systems put sellers in jeopardy, as any agent could represent them and cause jeopardy. And you're absolutely correct. So when we act in a sub-agent capacity, that's why a lot of brokerage houses have gone to, hey, we're happy to represent a buyer's agent. I mean, we're happy to pay a buyer's agent, but we don't want to pay a sub-agent because we don't want that responsibility of having someone else who doesn't work in our brokerage to say things about our seller or to represent our seller. So, we're happy to get on board with a buyer's agent, but we don't want to have a sub-agent. Now, actually, dual agency was allowed in Texas, but then it became illegal in Texas. So it became illegal in Texas in 2005. So intermediary came about in 96, and then we had it's illegal to practice dual agency. Some states still do, but Texas is not allowed to. So interestingly enough, yes, you do have a lot of risk management with operating under a sub-agent, okay? And so, yes, a sub-agent is usually working with a buyer without a buyer's rep. That's correct. However, you do have the issue of implied agency. So I want to remind you, if you walk like a duck, you look like a duck, you quack like a duck, you are a duck, okay? And so that is kind of the crux of implied agency. If I have treated you as if I were representing you, then the consumer client may believe, hey, she's representing me, therefore I'm her client. So understand, be careful what you share, be careful how you act, because it could be implied agency. But understand that as implied agency, you want to make sure that you do have a buyer agreement signed. So you need to get a buyer agreement signed. So I'm not sure about this question. Okay, so I think it's more of a statement. All right. So I will answer that later for you. Okay. So again, you don't have to represent the buyer. If you have the listing, you can always treat them as a customer. I always say it's old car when you work with buyers and sellers. It's fiduciary. You have old car. And when you work with a customer, I say it's hard, H-A-R-D, because all you owe them is honesty, accounting, reasonable care, and disclosure. So it's hard to work with a customer, but you certainly can, and there's nothing wrong with that. So you could definitely work with them as a customer. But in this particular webinar, we're talking about the intermediary, and that is where we are representing both under the same brokerage house. All right, so just understand this. You know, we're all in this together. Understand that all agents that work under the brokerage house represent the clients. So all agents under the brokerage house represent the broker's clients. So that means that if you have a listing and you have 300 agents, guess what? Those 300 agents, they represent the seller. So understand that you represent the clients from the brokerage house. So be careful of office talk, because you could be violating your confidentiality agreement. How many times have we had this at a sales meeting or just around the water cooler? Hey, I just got a new listing at 123 Elm, and you know, I know they've got it listed at this, but bring me something. They're going through a nasty divorce. Okay, don't be that agent. Be careful what you talk about. Be careful what you talk about. Remember, it's all about the property. It's not about the client. So please don't share any information about the client. And remember your role. If you're appointed, then you can give advice, opinions. But if you're not appointed, you are simply a facilitator. You need to keep quiet. You are not allowed to give advice or opinion. That means that if you must have 3 people in a brokerage house in order to do advice or opinion. Okay, remember that. So in order to have appointments, you must have a broker and 2 agents. You must have a broker and 2 agents. So in order to do that, you must have at least 3 in the brokerage house. A facilitator is not equal to a mediator. Okay, remember that. A facilitator is not equal to a mediator. We are not trying to mediate the transaction. We are simply facilitating. We don't advocate for one side or the other. You have to remain neutral. And that's hard. It's hard. Make sure to disclose intermediary early. Make sure to get it in writing. It's even on our information about broker services form. So that is going to be at first meeting. So you need to make sure that you explain everything to your client. And understand that we need to do a better job as professionals, folks. We need to explain to them, you know, when we act in this capacity, this is what this looks like. When we act in this capacity, this is what this looks like. So we need to share that information, okay? So make sure they understand the pros and cons of intermediary. If you're appointed, again, you can give advice and opinion. Remember, we've got those limitation prohibitive things. You know, you can't tell the seller they would, you know, pay more. You can't tell the buyer that they would take less. You can't tell confidential information, and you can't treat parties dishonestly. So understand that there's very limited representation if it is intermediary with no appointments. Understand that you're not allowed to give advice or opinions. Make sure that you disclose the ways that you can work depending on the transaction, and let them make that decision. Let them make that informed decision, because you need to do what's best for the client, not you, but the client, because you're a professional.
All right, Lori, it looks like you've got a couple questions that just came through. If I own a rental property with a longtime tenant and the tenant wants to purchase my property, can I privately sell that property to the tenant? The property would not be listed on MLS, and I would not be showing the tenant other properties.
Yes. So as long as your broker, because I don't know if you're a broker, but as long as your broker allows for that, then yes, you can sell it privately. Now, on paragraph 4 of the contract, you have to state that you're a licensed owner, or that you're a broker, you're a licensed agent, or you are a broker. So you have to state on there that you are licensed. But that would be the only requirement.
I believe you answered this, but just in case they missed the answer, in a 3-person brokerage, broker, spouse, son, can the broker do intermediary with appointments?
You can. Now, here's the unique situation with that. Because you are all related, okay, so you have the broker, the spouse, and then the son, the child. So you have it all in the family, right? So you might want to have a little disclaimer or some kind of disclosure that says, hey, look, we're all related. Are you on board with that? Because if the client goes, you know what, I'm feeling like, that's a little iffy. No, I don't want to do that. Then the client has the right to go and get, representation elsewhere. So you can do it with disclosure. Again, disclose, disclose, disclose. Okay?
All right, so this is kind of a two-parter. The question is, can the notice be signed when submitting the offer? This is how I do it after the listing and buyer rep agreement has been signed. Then I have both buyer and seller sign the notice DocuSign in front of the offer.
Absolutely. So that's exactly the way you need to do it. So you have an existing listing agreement, you have an existing buyer agreement. Now they come together. The sky's open. Yay! And they're going to purchase together. So they're going to work together in a transaction. So yes, at that point, then that is when you would sign the TAR form. So then you would get both parties to sign saying, hey, we talked about that, and yes, this is what we're going to do. So perfect.
Looks like she liked that answer.
Yay! I like that answer too. Thank you, Sandy.
All right. I think we finally got through all the questions.
Okay, let's see. We're just double checking the questions. I hope that this helped give you a little clarity. I hope it didn't muddy the water. Just understand that when you work as intermediary, there are basically two ways to work. Either it's going to be with appointments or it's not. Either you're going to have someone assigned or you're not. And you just want to make sure that, you're doing what's best for the client. Remember, your fiduciary comes before your paycheck, okay? Your fiduciary comes before everything. So do the right thing, be the professional. We're all in this together, but make sure that you are protecting your client above all.
Wonderful. Well, it looks like we've answered all the questions. I can tell you we've got a little bit of time if anybody has another question. Looks like we just got one. Why not put the clients together and let them negotiate? Is that an option?
Well, that's an interesting thought. We have actually had some of those issues where they do just put the clients together and let them negotiate, and then you just kind of sit at the head of the table. So, it's whatever your clients agree to and whatever your broker agrees to. So I always defer it to the broker because the broker is going to make the rules. So when in doubt, ask your broker. And as a broker, trust me, we want you to ask. We want you to ask. So it's all good.
Okay, perfect. Miss Jennifer, I see you're asking a question about the link for the PowerPoint. To answer your question, and anybody else who maybe missed this or you'd like to share it, we will actually post this full webinar on our website, which is mymetrotext.com, which has access to our YouTube channel. So it will be accessed in a few days. So you can always use this for a review since several people are asking for this PowerPoint to be shared with them. All right. And looks like we may have a couple more questions here at the end. Even a skinny article to share on social media. I'm sorry, Jennifer, that you can actually share our YouTube video on social media. So hopefully that'll answer your question for that as well. The last question that just came through is regarding the earlier 3-person family brokerage, so the son and spouse and whatnot. Mm-hmm. What if the broker owns the property that's being sold?
Boy, your question just gets better and better. All right. So there's a lot of blood flowing in this transaction. So here's the thing. As long as everyone is making the disclosure, okay? So let's say, I'm selling my property. My husband I put him on the listing. I own the property. My son is bringing a buyer. All of that would have to be disclosed. So I would have to disclose to the clients. I would have to put on paragraph 4 that, owner is licensed broker. Listing agent is spouse of broker owner. Son is related to listing agent and selling agent or buyer's agent. So, you would have to have all of that in paragraph 4. And another thing too is you would just want to make sure that the clients knew about that up front. So again, I think, buyers and sellers are very forgiving. If you are transparent, you are forthcoming with, hey, this is the deal. We have a family-owned business, and this is the way we do business. Are you okay with that? We don't pillow talk, but, here's what could happen. So at that point, you're just sharing information with them, and they can make that decision. But that's a great question. Great question.
Perfect. Got a couple more for you, Lori. One question we discussed a little bit earlier. The tenants want to buy the landlord's house. She said that wants to sell it privately, so no posting to the MLS. Why the landlord still needs to disclose to the broker? Isn't she acting as a FSBO? Is that a FSBO?
FSBO,
Okay.
affectionately known as FSBO. We're sell by owner.
Okay.
Okay, I am sorry. I thought that it was your house and you were selling to your tenants, so I apologize. So yes, if you have a landlord is wanting to sell to the tenants, they want to sell it privately, that's totally okay because you're talking about principal to principal. So that's a totally different animal. Now, if you're going to be involved in it, then you need to talk to your broker and find out how your broker wants you to handle that. Because that could be intermediary with no appointments, and at that point, you're just going to be a facilitator. But check with your broker and make sure. Now, if the landlord was an agent, let's say the landlord's an agent, then the landlord must disclose in paragraph 4 that they are a licensed agent selling the property. Whether they're selling on the MLS or not, it doesn't matter. It's a requirement of Article 12 of the Code of Ethics. It's also a requirement of our Licensing Act. Plus, they just changed the contract, and so paragraph 4 was added a couple of years ago so that we would remember to let people know that, yes, we are licensed, and so you have made that disclosure to the public.
Perfect. All right. Looks like we have another question by Jared. So if the broker is the listing agent on a property, can they do an intermediary without appointments, or is only no intermediary available?
They can do intermediary without appointments as long as you let your clients know, here's how this is going to look. Okay, I'm just going to be a facilitator. I can't give you advice. I can't give you opinion. You could also treat the buyer as a customer. That's always an opportunity for you as well.
Okay.
So either way, you could do it both ways. You could do no appointments, or you could treat them as a customer.
Okay, looks like we
Good
have
question.
one more question for you.
Okay.
What is the best way to disclose familiar relationships when you refer buyer to buying agent with other brokers? Not sure if I understand that question.
Okay, so are you talking about on the form that we had, the TAR form, the 14, I think it's 1402. Are you talking about that form, the intermediary form?
Ernest, I'm not sure if you're still listening, but if you can provide us with more details, and the answer is yes, that is the form they're referring to.
Okay, so on the 1409 form. Okay, so if you have familiar relationships, like when it talks about in paragraph F, additional comments or additional information. So let's say that I'm representing the buyer, and it's an investor buyer, and I've worked with them for 5 years, and I've probably sold 50 houses to them. Then that would be a way that you could disclose that relationship. So buyer's agent has worked with buyer over past 5 years, sold multiple properties as investor.
Okay.
Okay.
All right, and we're being asked to explain buyer as a customer a little bit more. We need some more explanation there.
So here's the thing. We don't have to represent every buyer that we work with. Okay. We can treat them as a customer. So Texas allows for customer status. Now, as you know, with clients, we owe them our fiduciary. And if you look at the information about broker services form, you're going to see minimum service. You're going to see what it means to represent the owner, what it means to represent the buyer. It has the intermediary in there. And then, of course, it has the sub-agent. But a lot of times, brokerage houses are risk managing by not allowing you to act as a subagent, okay? So with that, you can treat the buyer as a customer, okay? So if you have the listing and you have a buyer that wants to buy the house, then you can say, well, you're going to be a customer. And you might have your legal department or your broker may have a form for that says, hey, I just want to let you know you've had the opportunity, because I've shared with you, you have the opportunity to full on buyer representation, but you've chosen not to get that. And so consequently, I am only working in a capacity of a customer. So I am not, representing you in any way. I solely represent the seller. So that lets the customer know they have the opportunity for representation, but then you don't want to represent them. You're representing them as a customer only because you have the listing, and that's how you are representing the seller through your listing agreement. Does that make sense? So at that point, you just give them minimal, or actually you give them maximum information. Like, for example, people ask, well, do you offer CMA to a customer? Yes, but here's what you're going to do. Whereas you have a buyer client, you're going to drill that CMA down, you're going to drill that market analysis down and show them. You're just going to give the buyer the whole neighborhood. Here it is. Here's the information. You figure it out. So the buyer customer does not get as much representation as a buyer's client does. So again, it's hard. Remember I said it's hard to work with a customer. You owe them honesty, accounting, reasonable care, and disclosure. So that's it. Now, I know there's a lot of issue with subagent, but if you're not representing the buyer, then aren't you a subagent? Well, here's the thing. You don't have to be a subagent, because a lot of times if you're a subagent, you're not going to get paid. So brokerage houses have chosen not to, work with subagents because of risk management. What is a subagent? If you look on the information about broker services form, it tells you a subagent helps the buyer, but they represent the seller. So they help the buyer, but they represent the seller. It's like when we talked about a little history lesson, when everybody used to represent the seller. It's kind of the same way. So it's like, okay, I represent the seller. Please don't share any information with me you don't want me to share with the seller, because I will, because that's my job. So here's what I would say. A lot of places, especially in rural areas, still do use subagency. But what I would say is, it's better to represent them as a buyer or just as a customer. You're just a customer. So I'm not offering you any representation, although you need to share with them that they have the right to representation.
Perfect.
So again, disclosure.
All right. Well, Miss Lori, it looks like we made it through all of the questions that came through today.
All right.
Actually, I take that back. We got one last one. This is probably the last one you'll be able to answer.
Okay.
In the 3-person family firm mentioned earlier, where the broker owned the property and did intermediary with appointments, you mentioned disclosing all relationships in paragraph 4. Is that the TREC 1-4 family contract?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
So you should disclose your licensure and your interest in the properties or relationships with people involved in the transaction, even if it's, licensee or a broker representing a buyer or seller who is the party to the contract, even though we're not a party to the contract, they are. So if you have a relationship at some point, then you need to disclose that. So yes, disclose. Here's my motto. It's better to have disclosed too much than never to have disclosed at all. So disclosure is key.
Okay, well, perfect.
All right, great questions, y'all.
All right, guys. Well, just as a reminder for all of those who are watching, if you did not remember everything, you missed it, or you want to share it with anybody in your office, please look for this full webinar on our website. mymetrotext.com, via our YouTube channel. If you get stuck or need help finding those videos, you can always call your MLS department or your professional development department as well. Thank you so much, Lori. I think they all thoroughly enjoyed this.
Well, great. I'm glad.
Well, thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.